Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the DC Archives Fair and the first of our 3 afternoon sessions. I'm John McGowan, the NAAC Chair, and very happy to introduce our session on Monuments Men Archives, featuring Barb Akins, Mae-Jean Daniels, and Greg Bradsher. For those of us who are joining us virtually, if you have a question, you can send it along through the chat function, and we will offer your question to the panelists following their presentations. First up will be Barbara Akins, the moderator for this session, who is Chief of Collections Processing at the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art, where she has over 20 years experience at the Smithsonian. She's currently a senior member of a grant-funded team working on a large-scale digitization initiative, which recently ended its 6th year. And Barbara also serves as the head of a collaborative project to create an EAD consortium throughout the Smithsonian Institution. So Barb, the floor is yours.
Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. By now, most of us are aware of the story and the heroics of the World War II Monuments Men, or the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section of the U.S. Army. Some of us are hyper aware of the story because of the Hollywood film and the unprecedented interest it has generated in our shared collections of archival resources documenting the work of the Monuments Men. Now I need to pull this out. So today, we already know myself, Mae-Jean, and Greg Bradsher from the National Archives. I am also currently managing a grant project that's funded by the Samuel H. Kress Foundation for the preservation, processing, and creation of online EAD finding aids for 11 archival collections that are central to World War II era art provenance research. And this project led us to rediscover our Monuments Men collections. And I and my colleague, Ryoko Ueno, organized our current exhibition, which has generated a surprising level of interest. Also speaking today is Mae-Jean Daniels, Chief of the National Gallery of Art Gallery Archives, the department that cares for Monuments Men papers and other records documenting the gallery's history. She was curator of the display that's in the West Building, Founders Room, concerning the Monuments Men and the National Gallery of Art, and has written and spoken often on subjects relating to the gallery's past. She began her career at the National Archives, where she worked in various custodial units and in the Office of Presidential Libraries. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Greg Bradsher from the National Archives. He has worked off and on with Monuments Men-related records for nearly 20 years. During that time, he published 2 articles about the Monuments Men in Prologue, authored a 1,100-page finding aid, I am very impressed, to Holocaust-era assets and Monument Men records at the National Archives, and given presentations to numerous groups, including the International Federation for Art Research and American Association of Museums. He has also co-authored NARA's microfilm publication on the records of the Office of Strategic Services Art Looting Investigation Unit. So today I'm going to focus on the resources, just a few of the resources that we have at the Archives of American Art and our little exhibition that has been extremely popular at our exhibition space, which is at the Donald Reynolds Center for American Art and Portraiture up in Chinatown. So until recently, with the release of the Hollywood film, the fascinating story of the Monuments Men had been forgotten by many, if ever known at all. They were indeed an unlikely team of art curators, conservators, scholars, architects, librarians, and archivists who joined the military in service of their country, as did most men during World War II. Most were initially assigned to some kind of desk duty, but were later assigned to the newly formed Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section. Their primary mission was to travel with the Allied troops and identify and protect European cultural sites from bombing. But towards the end of the war, their mission changed to one of locating works of art that had been looted by the Nazis from the time of Hitler's rise to power in 1933 to the end of the war. The Monuments Men recovered and returned some of history's greatest works of art that had been stolen and hidden across Germany and Austria, some in castles and others in salt mines. Of course, there were other monuments men in other theaters across Europe. I think Jean's going to reference those. So why the Archives of American Art? We collect and make available the papers of artists, art critics and curators, art researchers, art dealers, and art patrons. Among our 15,000 linear feet of holdings are the personal papers of monuments men George Stout, James Rorimer, Walker Hancock, Thomas Carr-Howe, S. Lane Faison, Walter Horn, Andrew Cardnoff Ritchie, and Otto Whitman. The bulk of the papers were donated to the archives either by the creators themselves or their families. In addition, the archives has conducted oral histories with many of the men back in the 1970s and 1980s, including Walker Hancock, Thomas Carr-Howe, Faison, Stout, Ritchie, and Charles Parkhurst. But we did not collect these papers and oral histories because of their work during World War II. But rather because many of the monuments men went on to highly successful careers in some of the most notable arts institutions in this country. The papers that we have provide researchers with a personal perspective that is often lacking in the official government record, and further documents their later careers. As I mentioned, in 2012, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation awarded the archives $100,000 to help support a project to process and create online finding aids for 11 archival collections that are central to World War II era art provenance research. The archives have strong holdings to support art provenance research, many of which are already processed with finding aids. And the largest at 203 linear feet, which is fully digitized, the records of the Jacques Seligman and Company. An additional goal of this project is to create a dedicated provenance webpage on our website where researchers can access information about all of our collections and oral histories that are most likely to hold information that will assist them with researching the provenance of artwork that changed hands during World War II in order to establish a clear line of ownership. As we were writing our grant proposal, George Clooney announced the Monuments Men movie. So while we are shamelessly leveraging the movie for publicity, our original motive was to complete work that fulfills our primary mission. And at the recommendation of our consulting scholars, our Monuments Men collections were originally included in the grant proposal. And all have now been fully processed, and EAD finding aids are available online, along with substantial related digital content. So here we see Walker Hancock, Lamont Moore, George Stout, and 2 identified soldiers. So what makes this personal? For all I know, this also exists in I don't know. But on the back, it's inscribed by Thomas Carr-Howe, and he refers to George Stout as Old Pops. For example, valuable records for provenance research among the Monuments Men papers include this inventory of recovered art stolen by Goring, mostly in France, for his personal art museum. There are close to 1,000 works of art inventoried on the first floor, and another 214 sculptures stored on another floor, and 82 tapestries. It could be that this document is also found among Norro's records, I'm not sure, but researchers may be inclined to use this at the Archives of American Art, or perhaps follow the trail to the Archives of American Art as they compare this list to gallery sales records found among our holdings. There are many unscrupulous dealers in Europe who were buying and selling stolen art, and some of that art ended up in museums in the United States, either as a result of outright purchases or through patron and benefactor donations. Recovery and restitution of stolen art is a decades-long issue, and the Association of Art Museum Directors and the American Association of Museums issued professional guidelines that urge museums, to the best of their ability, to determine and disclose the provenance for works of art in their collections that changed hands during the World War II era. The guidelines are intended to help identify any works that may have been unlawfully confiscated during the Nazi regime and never returned to their rightful owners. So researchers would come to us to consult our gallery records and personal papers to establish a documentable chain of ownership. It is the complementary and contextual nature of our holdings that make them so valuable for provenance research. For example, in tracing the provenance of one Picasso painting, a researcher can start with the earliest transactions documented in the Seligman Gallery records, fully online, and then find additional correspondence about that same painting in correspondence between the original owner, a German dealer who fled Nazi Germany, and an art museum director and dealer in another collection. It is this interconnectivity among multiple collections that researchers find so valuable. So now you know our goals remain lofty and archivally pure and sound. I will highlight a few interesting documents and photographs from the exhibition. The exhibition runs through the 20th, and so you still have time to see it. It's just a few blocks up the street at 7th and 9th Street. One collection that we have the William George Constable papers. He was director of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and he communicates with George Stout. There are many letters back and forth about their initial ideas for forming a national conservation corps, one that would address art disasters here in the United States and not in Europe, and one that later expanded to include protection of European art, as we see here in Stout's letter and a draft he wrote for a plan dated December 1942. In the plan, he states, with the conviction that safeguarding of monuments is an element in the right conduct of war and in the hope for peace, we, the undersigned, wish to bring these facts to the attention of the government of the United States and to urge that means be sought for dealing with them. And George Stout, of course, is working. He was the leading art conservator in our country at the time, and he worked at the Fogg Museum. And Paul Sachs, director of the Fogg, was also part of this core group that formed the Harvard Defense Group. They compiled lists of endangered works of art and cultural sites. And I'm sure some of you at least have seen the movie. It was actually Paul Sachs who gave that slideshow to art colleagues as a call to action in 1941. The work of the Harvard Defense Group supported the formation of the Roberts Commission and the protection plan signed by the President. So here is a list of the potential monuments men drawn up by Paul Sachs. It's a very preliminary list, as you can see. It's dated, I think, 1943. And here we do see James Rorimer on the list, Thomas Carhall, Charles Parkhurst, and S. Lane Faison. And on the verso, we see James Rorimer listed again and George Stout. And the list is by no means complete and final. We don't see Walker Hancock, for example, who worked later with George Stout in the mines. So I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to play an audio clip for you of an interview with Walker Hancock. And we're going to hope this works.
How are you selected for intelligence?
Because of my Italian. They were at that moment looking for an American-born, Italian-speaking officer. And I seemed to fill the bill, and so I was put in the Pentagon. And after 7 months in the Pentagon, I managed to get out and get into the Monuments and Fine Arts and Archives.
The Pentagon work was pretty dreary.
Well, it was in an office, and very routine. Some of it was quite exciting. I mean, the intelligence at that time was a very fascinating thing to be part of. But it was office work all day, every day, and never a sight out of doors, and never a sight of action or a change of scene.
You obviously weren't able to do any drawing or sculpture.
Oh, none at all.
Yeah. And then how did you get toward the fine arts and monuments?
Well, of course, I knew of the commission, the Roberts Commission. And
what was the Roberts Commission?
The Roberts Commission was a commission formed, I suppose, at the instigation of Justice Roberts, because it had his name, but by the President and others to look after, protect as much as possible the works of art, science, architecture in battle areas. And knowing that this commission existed, of course, I was very eager to get into it. But when they requested me, I wasn't allowed to go until I had found a replacement for myself, which wasn't so easy to do. But it was accomplished, and I got overseas, fortunately, and had 2 years in Europe.
Now, could you describe, why did you want to go into this? Because it stood to try to preserve things that you had loved?
Oh, that was of course the reason. Yes, that was. And when one saw what was happening and what was bound to happen further in the war, it made you more eager than ever to have a hand in it.
Did you go first then to England? Was this before D-Day?
Well, before D-Day, 7 months. So we were sent to England first to be with the gathering army, and at the same time to write the handbooks that the soldiers would use on the continent, having to do handbooks for the Monuments and Fine Arts activities, and also to frame a directive that would be signed by General Eisenhower that would give all officers, the authority to protect certain monuments of art and architecture and scientific collections and other cultural objects, collections.
Well, because without that, there would have been no, in the order of priority, an officer wouldn't have paid any attention to those things, right?
No, there would have been no hope at all.
Yeah. How did fine arts eventually loom so high on the list of priorities? What do you think accounts for that? That Eisenhower finally would sign the directive?
Well, I think that by that time, there was a general awareness among all intelligent people, Army officers included, that this was going to be the most destructive war in history, and that something of that kind had to be done to save a fraction of the endangered objects of our culture.
So there's nothing like listening to an oral history, right? Just to get a real sense of history. See if I can get out of this. Okay. So in the interest of time, I'm just showing you a slide of the James Rorimer and Rose Vallance Paris collaboration. What we have in our papers that you see here on the left are James Rorimer's very earliest manuscript drafts of his memoirs that he later published. And here he writes about meeting Lalande and trying to gain her trust so that she will tell him where the art stolen from France is being stored. And here she writes, "Here, James, these are 2 photographs for you." This is from another page of the transcript, sorry. "Here, James, these 2 photographs are for you. They show you where you will find what you have been looking for. I count on you to get there and save our treasures before the Nazis can destroy them. Take my advice. What I tell you is based on more than a woman's intuition." And then we go on to the salt mines of Alsace in Austria, where the Monuments Men, led by George Stout and Thomas Carr Howe, found the mother lode, Hitler's personal collection of stolen art destined for the future Führer Museum in Linz. Here we see Thomas Carr Howe examining a panel of the Ghent altarpiece and George Stout supervising the removal of the Bruges Madonna. It was not in a cart as they show in the movie. Somewhat different, and they had more than an hour, I think, to get it out. And no, the mines had not been bombed as they showed in the movie. The workers, the miners themselves, had already removed what bombs there were. George Stout talks about this in his oral history interview. And the Ghent altarpiece was not being used as a table, as we saw in the movie. The Germans were very meticulous about storing their artwork, and everything was, as you see in the image in the upper right, it was stored and cataloged and inventoried. And the mines themselves were not really a terribly bad environment in which to store art. There was temperature and humidity, stability. So I want you to listen to the oral history interview with George Stout. No, he doesn't sound like George Clooney at all. You'll see that. Now I forget how to do this. I'm not seeing what I think what I'm supposed to see on the screen. Yeah, okay. All right, thanks. Okay, we're picking up...
It was interesting because of its connection with the old Prussian military tradition. And about the next one was at a slope mine in the Austrian Alps. And I went down there. That was 3rd Army area, General Patton. And I think you know the story of that. There's been a good deal published about it. So there's no use going into the whole business of what had happened in the way of military and governmental manipulation. Hitler's orders were somewhat confusing. One order was, this must never fall into the hands of the enemy. And there were others that weren't quite clear. But what this was, this repository, was the content of a museum which Hitler was collecting to be constructed at Linz. I think that was his birthplace.
I believe so.
And to be there as a memorial to his mother. It had been the great Hitler Memorial Museum of Linz. And there were some pretty prime things there. Ghent altarpiece, for example. Very fine Michelangelo from Bruges. I won't try to run down the list. That great Vermeer from Vienna, from the Czernin collection. I think it still was a Czernin title. However, that's a little sample. And then there were whole mine workings of furniture, quite a few sculpture, and just almost countless things of that sort. I don't really know the total number of holdings that were there. I think we once estimated it might be 10,000. Wow.
Oh. So here we see George Stout at the entrance to the Altaussee mines in 1945. And I think it's very telling that he lets us know that there are 10,000 works of art stored in this mine. You can access all of the oral history excerpts and most of the exhibition online at the Archives of American Art's website, aaa.si.edu, and you can also listen to the oral history clips. If you go to the exhibition, there's a number you can call and access the oral history clips on your cell phone. So that's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. That was extremely interesting, and you'll hear some of the themes that were running through Barb's talk repeated in mine. Can I make this go up a little? It is extremely rare for me to ask for a podium to be higher, so I'll make do. My talk is about the Monuments Men and the National Gallery of Art, based on the papers and records that are available in the gallery archives. For some background, I'm going to start by mentioning a few of the officers that had gallery connections. Lamont Moore was the curator of education at the gallery before and after the war. Among his other duties, he was in the 9th U.S. Army MFAA officer in charge of evacuation of looted art from the iron mine at Hudenweg. Craig Hugh Smythe was a curatorial assistant at the gallery before the war and, as a monuments officer, set up the Munich Central Collecting Point. John Skilton, another curatorial assistant, accomplished what seemed the impossible task of re-roofing damaged parts of the Residenz in Würzburg, Germany, to save Tiepolo frescoed ceilings. Edith Standen cared for the Widener collection for more than a decade before it was moved to the gallery in 1942, and later became an MFAA officer and director of the Wiesbaden Central Collecting Point. Others, including Perry Cott, had long careers at the gallery after the war. Cott was in Italy working in the monuments program during the earliest days of the Allied invasion, and later he became the gallery's chief curator for more than a decade during the 1950s and 1960s. And Chuck Parkhurst, you heard of him before, he played a particularly important role in our story. He was a research associate and registrar at the gallery before the war, and he served in the monuments program in Germany in 1945 and 1946, overseeing some of the most important work moving looted art to safety. But significantly, he returned to the gallery in 1971 as the gallery's deputy director and chief curator. Parkhurst had a very sharp understanding of the importance of the monuments program, and it was due to him that so many of the monuments men's personal papers came to the gallery. So while he was working at the gallery in the 1970s, he gave his own personal papers to the gallery and asked his friends and colleagues to do the same. And later, when a nexus of related materials had formed, friends and family of other officers gave their papers. These donations, including superb collections of Jim Rorimer, you'll notice split between us and the Archives of American Art for totally imponderable reasons, but we're happy to have them, Frederick Hart, Edward Adams, and others, thus making the archives an important center for study of the individual experiences of the monuments men. Plus, I should add that Charles Parkhurst made the arrangements for the National Gallery's photo archives, now the library image collections, to create preservation prints of some 40,000 negatives created by monuments officers of works of art that passed through the Munich Central Collecting Point that are here at the National Archives. As an aside, I remember those masses of negatives, many of them glass, in the old National Archives Still Pictures branch, 11W, if I remember correctly, where I began work years ago with Jim Moore decades ago. As another aside, my experience at the National Archives was helpful in another way, because when many of those monuments officers came to the gallery archives, they still had classified documents among them, and so I knew enough to get them declassified, which we did. Anyway, the gallery's involvement in the monuments program runs deeper than the lives of some of the officers. To give some more background, the museum opened to the public on March 17, 1941, a little bit more than 73 years ago. Realizing that war was likely, gallery leaders had begun to make plans to evacuate parts of the collection to safety soon after the museum opened. Thus, on January 1st, 1942, only weeks after Pearl Harbor, they were able to move some of the gallery's most precious works of art for safety to Biltmore House in North Carolina. With its collection safe, the museum turned its attention to making its galleries welcoming to military men and women and war workers in the city and to other concerns brought on by war. So as you've also heard from Barb, beyond the gallery as well, during 1942, there was high and growing awareness of the dangers posed by the war to the great monuments and cultural treasures of Europe. Two important groups of scholars, one centered at Harvard and another organized by the American Council of Learned Societies in New York, began to agitate for active American efforts to save Europe's cultural patrimony. They began to gather information on significant sites and collections that should be protected, developing in time lists of many hundreds of pages. But long lists are of little value if they're not put to use. At this point, the National Gallery, led by its first director, David Finley, stepped in, serving as the center of the cultural community's efforts to get Washington to take action. Finley himself was charming, persuasive, and self-deprecating, an effective combination. And the museum had the additional advantage that the Chief Justice of the United States, Harlan Stone, was an activist chairman of its Board of Trustees and a great lover of art. David Finley was able to persuade the Chief Justice to write President Franklin D. Roosevelt to propose a government commission whose sole concern would be protecting the landmarks and cultural materials threatened by war. President Roosevelt agreed, and the result was the American Commission for the Protection and Salvage of Artistic and Historic Monuments in War Areas, usually known as the Roberts Commission. A little background on the name of that, why it became the Roberts Commission, was that the initial hope was that the Chief Justice would agree to serve as the chairman to give the commission the gravitas that would be needed to make things happen in Washington, but he declined and instead asked Owen Roberts to serve as the chairman, and Roberts was the senior associate justice of the court, and that's why it became the Roberts Commission. The Commission's offices were in the gallery, and many of its staff were gallery employees. The physical location in Washington proved to be important, and with gallery's persuasive charm, the Commission had access to officials in the War and State Departments, and in the end, a voice in gallery policy. When the Commission held its first meeting in August 1943, only 13 monuments officers were in the field. Over time, the Commission persuaded the military to formalize and expand the Monuments, Fine Art, and Archives program, the MFAA, so that trained officers would be attached to the civil affairs sections of Allied armies to be close to the military action. The Commission found and recommended officers to serve in the program, and again, Barb has some of the wonderful documents to suggest how that happened behind the scenes. They had excellent information on officers who are already serving in the military, who were already part of the cultural and museum community, because Paul Sachs, who had educated an entire generation of museum leaders, headed the Commission's Personnel Committee. I think one of the reasons to think of the success of this commission is that it was really what I think of as a big tent operation, and not only did it bring together the interests of the cultural community, but it added to it. So, for example, Cardinal Spellman was a member of the commission, who was at that time the Catholic cardinal in New York, because of the real concern about church buildings that the armies would encounter in Europe. There are many, many examples of how they succeeded in reaching out very, very broadly through the American community. The Commission also effectively channeled the extraordinary knowledge of American experts and presented it within the military framework to reach units in the field. George Stout mentioned this, that among other activities, the Commission prepared guides and handbooks to be used by troops in the field with information needed to give what they called first aid to cultural materials on the ground. These publications incorporated the expertise of conservators, scholars, archivists, but they were published and distributed by the War Department. Working with the scholarly community and coordinating with experts in other Allied countries, the Commission and monuments officers also helped prepare reports of what came to be known as listed monuments, that is, places that should be preserved wherever possible. In addition, in time, using resources of the Frick Art Reference Library, almost 800 maps with overlays of cultural sites were prepared to provide comprehensive data on geography and monuments in embattled areas for air forces. These made possible some of the pinpoint bombing that dramatically saved at least some cultural landmarks as the war proceeded. And throughout, the Commission cajoled government offices and made ceaseless efforts to support the officers in the field. Yet, of course, the real-life adventures and achievements of the monuments men were extraordinary and important on their own. Military reports, personal papers, and numerous personal memoirs provide a rich picture of their work in these few intense years. Beginning with Allied assaults on Italy, and always few in number, the monuments men worked to save whatever was salvageable, protecting art and monuments from rain, vandals, and thieves with extraordinary energy and success. Frederick Hart was among the small handful of monuments officers who reached Tuscany in Italy while fighting continued. His papers later were given to the gallery archives. Outside Florence, he found the badly damaged church of Santa Maria in Impruneta and described crawling over beams and rubble to find what might be salvageable amidst the stench of dead bodies. I should add that he also had a sense of humor, and the bombing also fell on a 16th century tomb, so added to the misery of the current conditions. There were corpses from past centuries that he had to work his way through. Hart worked with his Italian colleagues to shore up the walls and save fragments of smashed sculptures, and he and other monuments officers performed similar miracles throughout Italy. The monuments officers also worked with Italian colleagues to locate and return works of art moved by Nazi armies. Not long before retreating from Italy, Nazi soldiers had transported paintings from museums in Florence to a jail in northern Italy. After the trove was discovered, Hart watched over the art until it could be transported back to Florence by the first train to move over the repaired rail lines and then by truck into the city. The return of the art in Florence was an extraordinary event, and Hart later described the tumultuous reception that a symbolic convoy was given during its slow procession through the ancient streets as they formally returned crated paintings to the city. The monuments officers did everything possible to conserve and consolidate damaged structures, but their records also show that some things were beyond saving. In Florence, the Nazis blew up beautiful Renaissance bridges across the Arno as they retreated from the city. The Ponte Vecchio was spared, apparently because of its bulk, but the ancient buildings surrounding it were destroyed, a reminder of the brutality of war and the miracle that so much survived. On a happier note, though, soon after the Allied armies arrived, working through the monuments officers, the government of Florence asked for measured drawings of the Ponte Santa Trinita, which the Roberts Commission was able to provide with the assistance of American scholars. The drawings helped salvage the stones from the river so that the beautiful span could eventually be rebuilt. And Frederick Hart, among others, was made a citizen of the city of Florence when he left there at the end of the war. Moving forward, as D-Day, June 6, 1944, approached, American and British monument staff built on the experience in Italy to prepare for the new assault. It was at this point that General Dwight D. Eisenhower issued his extraordinary statement that buoyed the officers' work. And again, Walker Hancock, his comments on that were fascinating, Barbara. Thank you for playing that clip. Let me quote from General Eisenhower's statement. It's amazing. He said, "Shortly, we will be fighting our way across the continent of Europe in battles designed to preserve our civilization. In the path of our advance will be found historical monuments and cultural centers which symbolize to the world all that we are fighting to preserve. It is the responsibility of every commander to protect and respect these symbols whenever possible." It's an extraordinary statement. Again, a very small handful of monuments officers entered France with the Allied armies. Their first task was to document and protect damaged cathedrals and other important buildings that they discovered, a task made more difficult given the large areas that they needed to cover and their limited resources and authority. Jim Rorimer was among the small group of officers, and his photographs capture the desecration and destruction that he found. Among other tasks in France, monuments officers located statues and church bells and other metal objects that had been taken during the German occupation to be melted down for armaments. The monuments officers did what they could to return them to the original sources. The officers also had the task of protecting listed monuments from careless troops. When Rorimer arrived at the Great Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel, he discovered that the 3 posted off-limits signs were useless and reported finding army vehicles roaring around the town with drunken soldiers at the wheel where no cars had been permitted before. His army reports were models of outrage and urgency, and in the end he succeeded in protecting the site. Rorimer also worked for weeks with military and local authorities to prevent the Tuileries Gardens in Paris from being used as an army truck depot. There are many, many stories like this as monuments officers followed the path of battle through Europe. all to be studied in the officers' official reports, their personal papers, beautiful photographs. The monuments officers' experiences changed, though, as the armies and monuments men as they entered Germany, where they began to discover places where the Nazis had hidden movable art and antiquities, libraries and archives within German borders. The existence of these repositories had long been suspected, but their scope proved to be astonishing. Over time, more than 1,000 storage sites were discovered, some small, but others sheltering accumulations of great art, including extraordinary objects looted by the Nazis from occupied nations, as well as works of art from German museums, also hidden for safekeeping in the last days of the war. Finding these hiding places and making sure that the objects they held were physically safe provided some of the most dramatic moments for the monuments men. Schloss Neuschwanstein, which Barb had a photo of, Mad King Ludwig's castle in Bavaria, may have been the most extraordinary of the hiding places. The castle had been the headquarters of Hitler's art-looting organization, the ERR, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, and within its walls, the monuments men discovered vast troves of art stolen from French Jewish collections, plus treasures from Germany's own national museums. Edward Adams, Jim Rorimer, Edith Standen, and others all were involved in securing the castle and removing the works of art. Charles Parkhurst was there too as the deputy chief of the MFAA section. His reports suggest the challenges of working with unrepentant Nazis, locked rooms, and even a secret chamber whose entrance could be reached only via a built-in cabinet with hidden panels. It sounds romantic now, but at the time it must have been very, very difficult. And of course, despite everything, the monuments officers persevered. With limited support, transportation, supplies, and manpower, they achieved the extraordinary feat of securing the treasures and safely moving everything to collecting points that they established as places of security and refuge. The monuments officers, many with backgrounds in museum administration, as you've heard, were supremely qualified to create these temporary repositories for the works of art that became their responsibility. The officers developed extensive surveys and inventories and created many photographs, such as those that are now at the National Archives and the Gallery's library image collections. Perhaps most important, though, the collecting points provided the organization and facilities that were needed as the monuments officers performed their final Herculean task of returning the precious art to owners, working closely with counterparts in other nations. The Roberts Commission had advised the State Department on the principles that should govern restitution, and it was these policies that guided the work of the monuments officers. The return of the art marked the end of their responsibilities, and after some more years of work, the collecting points did eventually close in the early 1950s, at various times before that also. In the meantime, most of the monuments officers were eager to return home and to take up their careers. Their letters and their personal wishes are documented in their papers at the archives, and I'm sure at the Archives of American Art as well. And that is one aspect of the movie that I think rang very true. They were quite homesick and ready to return home. In the end, it was the Roberts Commission in the conclusion to its final report that I think summed up their work very well. Let me read the final paragraph from the final conclusion. The successful activities of these few men is out of all proportion to their number and their position within the military machine. They were able to accomplish a task of great magnitude. The task was nothing less than to preserve as much as they could of man's creative past. We as archivists have the honor and privilege of ensuring that this story and their experiences can be studied and understood now and, of course, in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, where do I begin? The records. At the National Archives, we have probably upwards of 3,000 boxes of Monuments Men records spread amongst about 10 record groups. Last week, my colleague Sylvia Naylor, can you raise your hand? We put together like the best of and put that on our website, sort of outlining what is the most useful Monuments Men records for researchers. And we also prepared a little handout for that we passed around today, sort of outlining where the records are. And it's very simplified. I think I just used one example of the 3rd Army where Robert Posey was, but I could have mentioned the 1st Army where Walker Hancock was, and so forth. We also did not include what was happening in Italy, because I've done another piece of paper to do that, as well as the Far East. But this has been a subject of interest primarily for the last 20 years. It started really with art provenance research back in the late 1990s. Actually, it started in March 1996 when a young researcher came to College Park looking for information on Jewish deposits in Swiss banks. It became a search for stolen gold, and then within a year it was stolen art. Next year it was unpaid insurance. And we called this Holocaust-era assets, sort of grouped it all together. Because of the massive amounts of materials, and things weren't digitized back in those days, I produced a 1,000-page finding aid that sort of helps researchers navigate their way through our records. Nancy Yaide, who's also in the audience from the National Gallery of Art, and I were both bombarded on what records do you have and how do you exploit them, the Monuments Men records. So Nancy co-authored a book for the American Association of Museums on art provenance research, explaining how you exploit the records. So it got to the point where I would not talk to a researcher unless they read my finding aid and read her book first, because that would answer a lot of questions. The Monuments Men records are actually used not only for provenance research, but they're used for other purposes. For example, I think Barbara and Maygene alluded to cultural property in terms of property that was damaged, destroyed, repaired. Oftentimes, institutions are interested in what happened to their institution during World War II in terms of, we noticed the stained glass windows were blown out. When were they replaced and who replaced them? And did the Monuments Men help? So like that one photograph of Walker Hancock and Lamont Moore and George Stout at Marburg, there the stained glass windows from the church and from the University Library, the library windows were blown out by American bombs, and the church put their stained glass windows for safety. Well, it was the Monuments Men that helped bring them back and help reinstall new windows in the church, the old windows in the church, and new windows in the University Library. So there's that practical use in terms of what happened to an archival collection, what happened to a library collection. I would say for the last decade, every other year I get a call from the Italian embassy asking about a certain library collection that the Nazis had taken out of Rome. And every year I tell them, well, it was recovered. And it was sent to the Offenbach Archival Depot, and one of your captains signed for it. Thank you and goodbye. And then 2 years later, did we ever get our books back? So the records served a very useful purpose. What I thought I would do is tell you actually a story on how I use the records in one particular search. It was in March of 2009 that I got an email from an 82-year-old retired optometrist from Chula Vista, California, Dr. Bob Thomas. And he sent me an email saying that he was 18 years old in April 1945 with the 358th Infantry Regiment of the 90th Infantry Division, part of Patton's Third Army, and that he had received a concussion at the Siegfried Line, and he was not with his unit, but he was close by at a division headquarters. And that one day in early April, an officer came by and said, "Would you like to go on a little adventure?" And he said yes. So they hopped in a two-person motorcycle with a sidecar, and he got his rifle to protect the officer. And the officer's job was to go behind the advancing troops and write a press release. So they took off from about 40 miles east of Marburg, northeast of Marburg, Germany, and followed in the wake of the advancing troops. Well, the advancing troops of that division and that regiment on April 2nd captured two little German cities of Ransbach and Heimboldshausen. And then the next day they captured two more little towns, Philippsthal and Baca. And then they regrouped, crossed the Wear River, and the next day captured the mine at Merkers. Did anybody see the movie The Monuments Men? Well, in the movie they captured the mine at Merkers. And the mine at Merkers contained the remaining German gold. It had most of the major paintings from the Berlin museums, and it had all the remaining currency from the Reichsbank, and it also had the property taken from concentration camp victims, like wedding rings, eyeglasses, and gold fillings. In the movie, they find things in the wrong mine, but that's okay, because they still found stuff, and it wasn't a mine. It might have been the wrong mine in the movie. But in any event, he said that they took off on, he thought, April 1st or April 2nd, and they got to a little town, and they went into a mine. And he said in his email, he says, "I read your article, your 1999 article about Merkers Mine," and he says, "I know I wasn't in that mine, but what mine was I in?" And I thought, well, why not? Why not go and try and find? It'd be like a little fun adventure. And it's a tradition I've started with my colleague Sylvia. Once or twice a month on a Friday afternoon, we go on these adventures to search for something in the news, something that we know people are going to be interested in. And I think it started about 5 years ago with Dr. Thomas, the retired optometrist. So I went to the Army operational records, and I found out where the 90th Division headquarters was on April 1st. And I plotted that on a map, and I plotted Merkers on a map, and I said, okay, it's about 20 or 30 miles from point A to point B, and I know I'm talking about 4 days in April. Let's see if I can find another mine. I know where Merkers mine is. I know where he started out. And I started at Merkers and started working back, and in the records of created by the Monuments Men trying to find another mine. And I gave up, and I said, there must be another way of doing this. So I went to Google Satellite and that area, and I started looking for a mine. And I noticed there was a sort of anomaly on the screen. It was a big white pile. And I didn't know what that was, so I kept getting it smaller and smaller, and I got down there, and I didn't know quite what it was, and it said Philippsthal. So I did a Wikipedia search on Philippsthal and found out there was a potash mine there. And that was all, today, I checked even yesterday, still these big piles of potash. So I said, okay, so I went back to some records, in fact, this time intelligence records, and found out in that mine was captured records as well as German currency. And I said, okay, it could be that mine. It was captured on April 3rd. Could he have reached that point by April 3rd? I figured, well, yeah, that could probably have been that mine. And then I went to the records of the Marburg collecting point, since that was the closest collecting point, and started looking at those records until I found that there was a mine at Ransbach. And then I remembered George Stout and Robert Posey at Merkers. They found most of the German artwork there, but the Germans had also put some at Ransbach. So when they got ready to evacuate Merkers, they picked up first the paintings at Ransbach, took them back to Merkers, and then took all of it to Frankfurt initially. So I now had another mine at Ransbach. So then I started doing a Google search again, and I found a town nearby called Heimbelschausen. So I went back to Google and typed in Heimbelschausen, and up came a photograph from actually the Holocaust Museum of a bunch of burnt books in a mine at Heimbelschausen, and it credited the National Archives. I said, okay, how does Heimbelschausen relate to Ransbach? They're about a mile apart. So I went back to the Monuments Men type records again, the records of the military government of Hesse, to the monuments officer that was in charge, and realized that there was one mine, but it had an entrance at each town. And then there was a tunnel salt mine that connected the two. So then I said, okay, that's probably where he was. So I sent him an email. I said, you're probably, based on the chronology, you are probably at Ransbach. Do you have any other information that could help me? And he sent me a little packet of stuff in the mail, and it was a little hand-drawn map of going into the little town and where the mine was and the streets, and also Xerox copies of 2 16th century books. And he said, by the way, when I was in the mine, I picked these 2 books up. And there were one German, one Latin, and they were 16th century law books. So I wrote him back, and I said, so you found some books in a mine. And I guess it must have been Ransbach, the ones that didn't get burned. So I thought, well, this is intriguing. So I contacted the German embassy and got a hold of the cultural attaché, Bertram von Moltke, and I said, here are the name of 2 books. Are they yours? He said, I'll contact the German Library Association and ask anyone if it's theirs. So then I went back, and make a long story short, I found that once the Americans landed after D-Day, the Germans started evacuating the looted property and their own property to the south, mainly to Bavaria, but also to Hesse and Thuringia. And that the Prussian State Library in Berlin sent 1.5 million books to this mine at Ransbach. The Dusseldorf State Library sent 500,000 books, and the University of Marburg sent 250,000 books. Also, the Berlin State Opera sent 200,000 costumes and sheet music and musical scores to the same mine. The Germans found that salt mines were good for preservation purposes. That's why you end up having all these salt mines. Well, I learned this from the Marburg records, figuring that records the contents of the mines would eventually go there. Well, as it turns out, I read reports from the people, including Walker Hancock, that on April 25th, about 3 weeks after the mine was discovered, a bunch of freed slave laborers who were in who had been working various mines, whose clothes were tattered, and many didn't really have much clothing. They all, and some of them helped unload trains and take things into the mine. They knew there were costumes in the mine. So hundreds, if not thousands, of former slave laborers went down in the mine and found new clothing from various operas. And I read in one account where the townspeople saw all these people emerging from the mines, walking the streets in 17th and 18th century costumes. Well, they were smoking in the mine, and it caught on fire. And when the Americans finally went to check out the mine, it was smoldering, so they brought in their conservation people who said, well, we really can't help you, but what you can do is stop the fire. So they ended up bricking both ends of the mine, hoping the fire would burn itself out, and they said it'll take probably 6 months. It actually took longer. It wasn't until the next spring of 1946 that they were able to retrieve the books, costumes, and start returning them. The books from the Prussian State Library couldn't be returned to Berlin, where they came from, because that was now in the Soviet sector of Berlin. So those 1.5 million books were loaned to the University of Marburg, where in the 1990s they were finally sent back to Berlin. Back to Dr. Thomas's 2 books, I had suggested that he return them, and I told him that I would work for the German officials so he wouldn't be charged an overdue fine on the 2 books, and he said, sure, that sounds good. I said, we have some presidential libraries, record centers, regional branches. They could come by, pick them up, and get them to me. And he says, no, I want to bring them to Washington and give them back in person. So I called up my colleague at the embassy and told him what I had in mind. And he said, oh, the ambassador would love that. So I went through the chain of command here to the archivist, and we set up an event in room 105 with the German ambassador, the acting archivist, Dr. Thomas, the 2 books, and the books were returned. As it turns out, the German library community found out that the books had come from a public library, one of them from a public library in Bonn, and another one came from a museum in a town called Paderborn. And the Washington Post ran a nice little story about it the next day, showing Dr. Thomas and holding his 2 books. And he brought it in like a little cardboard box and dumped it on a table in front of the acting archivist and the German ambassador. It was sort of embarrassing. If I'd known that, I'd gotten him a nice archives box or something. But it had a happy ending. So I hope this was a happy ending to your afternoon with the monuments men. I guess, Barbara, you want to have questions?
I think Todd's going to come back up. I think there's...
Now, I know that's not for me, but great job by all 3 of them. All right, let's see. Any questions in the room? You have any questions, please feel free to come down. There are microphones in the aisles. And let's see. There does not appear to be any questions online at this time. All right, there are 6 people who tuned in online to watch. You have a question coming down?
Hi, I'm Deborah Wynn. I work at the Library of Congress, and I'd kind of like to say there's 4 institutions involved. We also have a few scattered artifacts because a lot of the confiscated materials that the Germans got, and also there was a Library of Congress mission to Germany at the end of the war. And a lot of this stuff that ended up they didn't know what to do with ended up at the Library of Congress. But I was involved with cataloging the Third Reich collection because the library ended up with Hitler's private library, or a portion thereof. And it kind of expanded because it turns out there was a lot of confiscated German material, and I got transferred to Princeton Photographs to work on things. I was initially in rare books. I know that there's other stuff throughout the library, but we do have Rorimer's copy of the Kümmel report, which was basically the shopping list that was prepared for the Nazis to go and target different institutions throughout Europe and come back with their pieces. So I'm just saying there's wonderful things out there. It's not just in your institutions. And we also have a nice photo album that belonged to Pomerantz that identified book plates that were in books that were taken from Jewish institutions or families throughout Europe. And we have an index volume to some of these book plates. So I pinch myself when I go to work because I'm a German specialist, so we're low on staff, so I kind of get transferred around. And so just there's other institutions out there too. So I'm excited.
Both Greg and I, we may have the same question. In what unit is the Kümmel report? I mean, for those.
The Kümmel report turned out a researcher came in and it was in our general collections.
But you mean it's cataloged as a book?
It's cataloged as a book. It's a mimeograph typescript. It's copy number 1, but it's signed, has Rorimer's signature, and it was turned in to the State Department, and the State Department turned it into us.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting because I don't know how many years ago I got a request from a researcher working for Robert Edsel asking about the Kümmel report. And I went to our State Department name index and I tracked it down to correspondence between Ardelia Hall at the State Department and Rorimer, and she was suggesting that he give it to the U.S. government. And there was correspondence back and forth saying he would agree to do that. And the trail just stopped there. And I've always been curious as to, so you're saying he did give it to the State Department?
Right, and you wouldn't know that it was called the Kümmel report. I mean, I looked it up at lunch. You know, I looked up in the online catalog to get the full title, and it's des Zweiten Bericht auf Erlass des Reichsministers und Chefs des Reichskanzlei RK 118-2a vom 19. August 1940 und auf Erlass des Herrn Reichsministers für Volksaufklärung und Propaganda BK 9900 betrifft Kunstwerke und geschichtlich bedeutsame Gegenstände, die seit 1500 ohne unseren Willen oder aufgrund zweifelhafter Rechtsgeschäften in ausländischen Besitz gelangt sind.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Spine-Title, geraubte Kulturgüter, 1941. So, stolen culture goods, 1941 is the spine title translated. And finally, I cleaned up the record, and I have an alternative title, Kümmel report, so you can actually find it. But it was assigned a catalog record in 1968, and it was lost in our catalog for many, many years.
The person that asked for it, I don't know if she was working with Robert Edsel at the time, but I remember it very clearly because I had never heard of it before, and it was interesting. The other thing, Seymour Pomerantz, who was the head of the Offenbach Depot, allowed a lot of books to go to the Library of Congress mission. And of course, that was criticized in the Presidential Commission in 2000 for whatever reasons. And when I spoke to him last, before he passed away, he asked me, did he do the right thing? And of course, I couldn't really say. I just said you did a good job.
Well, anyway, you look at what they had to work with and the amazing amount of work that the Offenbach Archive did in the space of 3 years. They restituted over 4 million items. Absolutely amazing. And a lot of the books that we ended up with had very skimpy provenance markings. There was the sheer amount of things. A lot of stuff got sent back. I went to a conference in Berlin in 2007 where German libraries and archivists are working together because with the reunification of Germany, a lot of the records got split, and they're back, and there's a restitution project going on behalf of the German government that German libraries and archives are involved in. And they've got a key of markings that are in books that heretofore were unexplained, but then they've got this key to figure out where actually some of this stuff came from. So it's opening up a whole new area of research and work for people. So, I mean, this work will continue. And I figure as long as the stuff was saved, the stuff's in collections, the United States has signed on to the restitution for Holocaust-era assets, the treaty that came out of that meeting in '98. So, yeah, keep asking questions, keep discovering things. Thanks.
Leading off of that a little bit is something that I think is worth thinking about, is why this whole effort, I mean, in this venue, on this occasion, why it was monuments, fine arts, and archives, and the particular role that archives had, and Seymour Pomeranz in particular. And he was a known figure around the National Archives when I worked here all those years ago. And of course, the thing that is really wonderful about it is to realize that broadly within not only the cultural community, but within the government, there's double significance of archives, both because of the importance as cultural artifacts, the ancient manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts, things like that were in Europe were important. But there was also the recognition of the importance of government archives and the need to preserve, town hall records and that kind of thing. And as the monuments, among the things that were moved to the hiding places were in fact the current operating government records of Germany. So to me, anyway, as an archivist, it was really important and interesting to realize that dual importance was really recognized, especially, because so much attention is given to, the Bruges Madonna. Well, there's also the intellectual property and just simply the business of keeping a society going that was involved.
Just one quick note. In this building in 1942, a professor from George Washington, Ernst Posner, gave a lecture on the importance of archives in wartime, especially government archives, their usefulness. And after his lecture was done, Fred Shipman, who is the first director of the FDR Library, wrote a memo to the president saying that I heard this lecture and I have to emphasize the importance of the Italian archives, the governmental archives. So at the next cabinet meeting, the president told each person, come up with something to protect European archives. And General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, sent a message to Eisenhower in North Africa saying, you got to protect the archives. And eventually someone got the idea, well, you can tell them, but there's no archivist here. So they said, Fred Shipman, it was your idea. We'll send you off to Italy, and you can tell the troops to protect the archives. And off he went. And when we had a event in this room on February 19th on the Monuments Men, Fred Shipman's daughter and granddaughter were here for it. They had come down from Princeton. So I always feel a special interest in the archivists. They always, at the time, they felt like they were the third-class citizens compared to the artists and the sculptors and the professors. So my friend Sylvia and I have written 13 blogs on different monuments men, and the next one next week is on yet another archivist. So we've done Seymour and Hilary Jenkinson,
right,
the British archivist, and next Tuesday will be Lester K. Bourne.
Great.
So we tried to give the archivist a shout out compared to the George Clooney, and
we all are.
the other people.
Right. Well, and Ernst Posner is another example of that, and another link between our two institutions, kitty corner across the streets, because Ernst Posner is the perfect example about why the cultural community was so totally aware of what was happening in Europe, that there were, the cultural community was highly educated, they spoke multiple languages, they traveled back and forth, but there were also very, very influential refugees. And Ernst Posner, who had such an important role in the beginning of the archival profession and education, especially for archivists in the United States, was one of those. And when I started the archives at the National Gallery, one of the moments when I thought, oh, I'm home, was when I discovered that in the files of the General Counsel's office at the National Gallery is a file about getting Ernst Posner refugee status. I don't know what it is, a green card. I don't know what they called it back then. But there was our Ernst Posner in the National Gallery, and again, it was this really kind of clear understanding of what led to the Monuments Men. They didn't just drop out of heaven. There was this really very broad-based cultural concern, and it's one that we really are the inheritors of, and that's a pretty wonderful thing.
One thing that I have found interesting that I didn't mention is that many of the Monuments Men maintain their relationships throughout their lives. This was sort of alluding to a small community. They wrote one another throughout the up to the 1970s, and they would talk about, well, I'm going to be somewhere at such and such a time. How's your wife doing? You think we could get together? There was one letter I saw where Rose Valland was coming to the United States, and they were all excited to catch up with her. So I found that interesting that they maintained this relationship. And back to the notion of shared collections, Gina and I started talking about this a couple years ago, I think, about these shared collections that we knew we have, and I think that it's we're talking about shared collections about one particular theme, but I'm sure that there are other shared collections that we have where our collections tell this part of the story, there's another part of the story, and yet there's another part of the story, and so while it's nice that we have this great little talk about it, I'm sure that there are other ways through cataloging and online access that we can work to bring those collections closer together. Rorimer, by the way, Rorimer's wife gave the papers to us, and the daughter gave the papers to National Gallery. Yeah, so I think that's how they ended up split. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Actually, a two-part question, then a personal observation, if I might. I don't recall which one of you mentioned the amount of gold that was discovered, but as a practical matter, what happened to the gold? I mean, was that stolen also, or was that Germany simply, or the Nazis simply hiding the gold? And then the second question is, in sort of the process of returning personal art versus museum or collections, sort of public collections, if you will. Did someone, or is someone doing a considerable amount of genealogical work and research? Because I'm curious as to how art that was held by German Jews or French or citizens or others, how at this point in time are you tracing that back with some degree of certainty that the right family or the right heirs are in fact getting art or other objects that rightfully belong to that family?
Well, two quick answers. The first thing that the Germans did when they marched into a country like Belgium or Netherlands, they didn't go for the art, they went for the gold. And they took the gold because countries with whom they dealt with, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Turkey, wouldn't take German marks in payment for anything. They wanted either Swiss francs or gold. So the Germans, in order to keep their war machine going, the first thing they did was took the gold. That gold, a lot of it ended up in Switzerland. And 12 years ago, there was a whole big to-do about it. Tons and tons of books written, Nazi gold. The gold ended up, for the most part, going back to the countries from which it was stolen. Except for that, it ended up in Switzerland. They only agreed in 1946 just to give a small portion back. In terms of the restitution, most of the material in the American zone ended up in the Munich Central Collecting Point. People or countries would make claims. The monuments men would investigate it, and they determine, yes, this probably belongs to this person or that country museum. They then would return it, not to the museum or to the person, they would return it to the country and let them have the final decision. That way the Americans wouldn't be responsible. It used to be very, very difficult to do provenance research because you would have to go through those 2,000 boxes at the National Archives. We've now digitized 2.3 million images, and it's truly amazing. Things that we used to take weeks sorting out a particular piece of art, some small piece of art, you can now type it into the website Fold3, and all the documents just pop up, and it shows you when it was stolen, when it was recovered, who it was returned to. It wasn't an exact science. The monuments men did their best, but they did make mistakes. They did give things back to the wrong country. We have this case in Germany now, where the Gerlich case, where they let an individual reclaim his art, where probably some of it was stolen. But again, you can search in our records under the Wiesbaden collecting point and find out the name of the painting that this individual had, all the information about it. In this case, we gave it back to the person that claimed it was theirs, and that may or may not be the case based on the current lawsuits.
Thank you very much. If there's no one else asking a question, I'd like to make a quick personal observation. When I was in the Air Force 3 weeks out of high school, and I spent most of that over in England with some travels in Europe, but never to Germany. But I got out of the service, and I went to a place called Paul Smith College of Arts and Science, way up in the northern Adirondack Mountains. And sort of strange for forestry majors, we took world history in our first year, and this was just an associate's degree program, but it was a wonderful, diverse program. And my history professor was a guy by the name of McKee, Doc McKee, and we had a very big, thick world history book. And Doc McKee had been a staff assistant at the trials in Nuremberg, which was quite interesting because he described the demeanor of the Nazis and what have you. But as a young man, and there were mostly men in this school, we got all excited when Doc McKee told us about, and you can correct the title of whatever this gentleman was, but August the Strong of Saxony. And he said he fathered 365 children. which we were all impressed by. How many women, I don't know. But I would tell that story once in a while, and I carpooled from Falls Church to Alexandria and different places for 17 years with a German friend of mine, and once in a while, things were a little quiet or slow, I'd tell him the story. Well, I was telling the story in an elevator, our office elevator down Alexandria one day, and it happened that the German Luftwaffe Washington office was up in the floor or two above us. And I was telling this story to my friend, and August is Strong had fathered 365 children. And a very heavy Germanic accent in the back of the elevator said, 385. And in the same voice he said, the history books are generally wrong at that point. So, personal story.
It's great.
Thank you all for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much. Let's hear it again for our panelists. Thank you. All right, so we will come back at 2:45, as you can see there on the screen, for our next panel presentation. So please feel free to make your way back out to the hallway and visit with our exhibitors, and we'll see you back here in 20 minutes. Thank you very much. Everywhere. Gentlemen, ready? All right, well, welcome back, everyone, to our next panel presentation, which will feature two individuals doing great work here at the National Archives. Full disclosure, they're both friends of mine, but I would have said that anyway. I'm still John McGowan, the chair of NAAC, and in just a moment we're going to hear from both Jerry Simmons and John Martinez. Both Jerry and John work in the Office of Innovation here at the National Archives, where Jerry serves as NARA Authority Cataloging Team Lead, and John is the Director of the Business Architecture Standards and Authorities Division. First up, John will bring us up to date on the Archival Authorities Cooperative project, followed by Jerry, who will speak to the Encoded Archival Context, Corporate Bodies, Persons, and Families, also known as EAC-CPF. I would think that that's a much easier way to say that, standard that is being used for these authorities. As with the previous sessions, if you are joining the presentation virtually, we encourage you to send in your questions through the chat function, and please send it along, and we will have some time for Q&A at the end of their presentations. Please join me in welcoming both Jerry and John.
Thank you. As John said, I'm going to give an overview of sort of the progress of the work on the Archival Authorities Cooperative, focusing on NARA's involvement in it, and then the fun stuff, the interesting stuff from Jerry, where he's going to talk about EAC-CPF and give some examples of what we've been experimenting with NARA authority data. So, like I said, I'm going to talk about the cooperative, the planning activities and progress to date, how we're looking at the cooperative administration and governance of the cooperative, the technological infrastructure, and sort of the next steps, sort of a broad timeline. And like I said, I'll try and go quickly as we're in a shorter time slot here. So the goal of the project, of the Authorities Cooperative, is to transform an existing project, it's been around a few years, the Social Networks and Archival Context, the SNAC project, into a cooperative program. SNAC is a project that's been led by the Institute for Advanced Technology and the Humanities at the University of Virginia. It's been managed by Daniel Pitti there. And the goal of SNAC, and by extension, what they're trying to realize with, what we want to realize with NAAC, is to build and maintain a large database of authority records describing corporate bodies, persons, and families. So these are the record creators and other entities documented in records. link to descriptions of records for, to achieve sort of union access, and link to one another to identify and pull out the inherent social, professional, intellectual networks. The vision is to be cooperatively maintained by the professional community, which is broadly defined as, of course, archivists, librarians, scholars, documentary editors, historians, etc., hopefully or ideally with an aspect of crowdsourcing as well. The SNAC project has done a lot of prototyping and experimentation so far, and they've sort of developed a prototype already for the technical realization of this. So why? Why is this being done? What's the value? I'm going to show some statements by some of the key people involved in the project who are on the advisory board. I don't want to flash through them too quickly, but I also don't want to read these at you either. So this one is from Anne Van Camp of the Smithsonian. She speaks, and I think you'll see this as a common theme that these individuals identify as the value. She speaks to the possibilities to aggregate data across repositories and the resulting benefits to researchers and the benefits of the common authority file for archivists. Similarly, Ed Ayers from the University of Richmond sees the possibilities, and he has a very high-minded statement of dramatically affecting the way that historical research is undertaken and written. And then Alan Liu from UC Santa Barbara also speaks to the power of aggregation and linking of authority data and the deeper knowledge that can be derived about the people and organizations in archival holdings. So planning to date. The work on the NAAC started really in May 2012 when 87 archivists, librarians, scholars, and representatives of the funding agencies at that time met here in this building. We had a second meeting again in 2012 in October with a smaller group, 27 archivists, librarians, again the funders at that time. While these meetings were intended to be partly informing and explaining and part brainstorming, each was almost entirely the former, not the latter, which was okay. In other words, there was lots of discussion of what we want to do and why we're doing it, as opposed to getting into a blueprint of how to. And a strategy for moving forward emerged. In early 2013, in January, a group of the NAAC leadership came with Daniel Pitti to NARA, met with the executive leadership here, and as a result of that meeting, the archivist endorsed NARA to be the host for the cooperative, and by the host, the host in terms of administration and governance. Technical is another issue, which I'll talk about as well. The technology infrastructure is to be developed outside of, though in collaboration with NARA. And the negotiations for the host are still underway. At this point, it's still not 100%, but California Digital Library has shown great interest, and we're working towards having them serve as the technical host for the cooperative. In 2013, there were two more meetings. One here in June on administration and governance. There were two later in the year at the Coalition for Networked Information, focusing on the technical infrastructure. As you can see, July and October. No NARA representatives were able to go to that one because of the shutdown. But a few decisions were made, or a few decisions in terms of direction were made, that the scope initially will be national, U.S., and focus on archival authority data. Longer term, the idea is to be potentially international and expand to include archival description and access more broadly. And the idea is to begin with a pilot phase of 2 to 4 years, use that pilot to build trust, to build a community, the infrastructure, and really flesh out the long-term business and governance model. And one concept that didn't necessarily start there. It's sort of the overarching one is that the data that's part of this cooperative will be freely available as a public good. So administration and governance, as I said, we've been working to determine NARA's role after the archivist, committed NARA as taking a lead in this area. We've been looking at models like the cooperative cataloging programs at the Library of Congress. We talked a lot to Paul Frank, who's been very helpful. In developing these policies, we recognize the need to ensure community involvement and approval. We also need to be sure we tie it to NARA's mission appropriately, and there's larger issues like establishing the cooperative as a legal entity. Questions around the best way to do that. And then these are sort of the issues in developing administration and governance that we're looking at, which are, I think, pretty typical for this kind of endeavor or partnership. Legal issues, membership, who can be members, how will that work, what will responsibilities be, the standards, reporting, what kind of reporting the cooperative members will want, data ownership, and training. And then, as I said, there's the whole issue of the relationship of the administrative and governance side to the technical side. The vision broadly is, as I said, the cooperative with NARA as a host and administrator, and a technical home hosted outside of NARA, but developed in collaboration with and guidance from the cooperative. And in terms of the structure of sort of the administrative bodies that would be involved in this, this is notional, obviously. There is no governance board, there is no advisory board yet. But we're thinking it might look something like this in terms of a governance board with a SNAC advisor committee, sort of the key members, in this case, presumably the California Digital Library, UVA, NARA, Library of Congress, Smithsonian, representatives from the academic side. Also, we have the potential for a public or independent member and an advisory board to provide scholarly advice and to further define the role of the cooperative. And the key characteristics in looking for people to fill, or institutions, it's really people, to sort of serve and work on these administrative and governance bodies would be people with passion for the effort, people who are invested in it, passion for solving problems, and who are looking for progress on similar topics or issues. And as well, however it ends up, members will be, will have to have an interest in community building relationships, developing constituencies, getting support from users, and again, traditional researchers and scholars, as well as non-academic, the genealogical side, and the public. So the technical infrastructure, I'm going to speak very briefly about this, is, again, notionally, there would be a repository with a maintenance and editing interface, as well as a public interface if we go for to support the idea of having sort of crowdsourced contributions as well. And that it would again be developed by community partners in collaboration with NARA. And this is sort of the notional, very notional concept of how it might work. As you can see on the one side is the professional side on the maintenance with the maintenance system, where at the top it's representing sort of systematic input of bulk data or from platforms such as ArchivesSpace. And on the bottom shows the editor interface where individuals would create and edit or do other manual entry into the system. And then the publishing system, again, notionally would support sort of crowdsourcing contributions and output of data as well. So the next steps, IS at UVA has a proposal to the Mellon Foundation for the next phase, which is the final stages of being approved. The timeline is from April 2014 to the end of the year, to prepare a charter document for NARA, to prepare a data ownership document, deal with issues like the rights for extracted data from contributors, to do user requirement studies for the maintenance and public interface, and to further develop the technological requirements, the hardware and software that will be needed, as well as to work up the partner agreements. As I said, the meetings start this month. I hope that when we do this update at SAA this August, which I hope people will be at as well, we'll have a lot more to tell you. We should be well along on developing a lot of this at that point. So now Jerry's going to speak some more about the core standard, the EAC-CPF, for the project, and what he's been, give some examples of what he's done with NARA authority data so far.
Oh. Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again to John LeGlowick, not John Martinez, for the great introduction earlier. I will go ahead and make two remarks for our start. First, I'll answer everyone's first question. No, it is not a clip-on. Second, I know, a good 45 minutes in front of the mirror before you leave the house. Second, I reserve the right at all times to go off script. Slides are wonderful to remind me of what I should be talking about, but I oftentimes get excited about stuff and want to talk about other things. Related, but not. So here's a very quick snapshot of the history of authority work, authorities cataloging. If no one has ever heard of authorities cataloging, lean to the person next to you and say, have you heard of it? Because I'm going to go through this really quickly. So basically, it's the control of names. It's also the control of subjects. And up until 2000, it wasn't being done at the National Archives. And when the new Archival Research Catalog came on the scene in about, technically about spring of 2001, summer of 2001, we started to attempt this for the first time. We started working on 2 authority files and 3 thesauri that were built into the ARC system. It's not external systems. They were all built inside the cataloging database. The 2 authority files, which I'll talk about most today or make reference to, are authority files, one for the names of federal agencies, familiarly known as corporate headings. Here at NARA, they are referred to as organization headings. And then the second is the authority file for names of people. We've done a couple of focused biography projects over the years, one that wrapped up in 2003 for biographies to add in information to the authority records that already existed for presidents and first ladies. There was another one that launched later on for military figures biographies that happened in July of 2006. In April of 2003, we started cataloging for the entire agency. This is from Anchorage to Boston to Atlanta to Fort Worth, and all the presidential libraries included. All the authorities cataloging was happening in the one central location in College Park. We started our NAAC contributions in October of 2003. NAAC is the name authority cooperative run through the Library of Congress, where we take all of our authority data and we contribute it into a larger system for use by a wider cataloging public. We also started in April 2004 SACO contributions. SACO is the Subject Authority Cooperative, where we actively, and still do it today, contribute subject and geographic headings into the Library of Congress authority files. In 2011, we started to think about the development of a new XML-based cataloging system, one that would handle description and authority cataloging equally. That system is hopefully soon, within the next few weeks, going to be rolled out and deployed. This will allow us to export our authority records as XML. It's something we've never been able to do before. We've done several subject heading conversion projects. For instance, for the first 8 or so years of the cataloging effort, in ARC at the National Archives, we were using the Getty standard for geographic headings, and we recently did a conversion to change all of those over to Library of Congress headings because they're much easier to control and it's an easier standard to follow. So for this summer, we're looking for an anticipated contribution to SNAC, and John has mentioned SNAC already, the Archival Authority Cooperative. And then we hopefully in May, where that's the target date, we are hoping to contribute our entire authority files, both the people names and corporate organization headings, to the SNAC project. So all of our, one effort will turn our ARC authority records into EAC CPF records, and I'm very excited about that. It saves me a lot of work. In the context of RDA, EAC CPF, SNAC, and IDLOC, we have to take a close look at what has happened recently in the cataloging field. There was a switchover, for those of you who know about the specifics of the cataloging standards. The Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, 2nd edition, went away, and RDA, Resource Description and Access, appeared on the scene. And now all cataloging has to be done in this format, especially for the authority records that we contribute on a weekly basis to the Library of Congress. We have to do them in the RDA content standard now. Once they go into the system as RDA records, we participate through the NAAC program, and that's the gateway into the Library of Congress name authority file. After I do the contributions one afternoon, by the next morning, our names from the National Archives are already in the overnight revision of the authority file. By virtue of being in the LC name file, our names eventually end up in the VOF, or the Virtual International Authority file. Because they're in the Library of Congress name authority file, they're also accessible by the idloc.gov. This is the Library of Congress's rather new linked open data service for sharing their vocabularies in common formats. So eventually, when we're able to pull in and push out from our system, we'll be able to get linked open data between the National Archives and the Library of Congress authority files rather easily. And finally, with the authorities in EAC CPF, linking and sharing options appear to be endless. So here are a few examples. So that's the academic administrative portion of it. Here's the fun part. And again, I went off script, so I have to catch up. Okay, let's start with a really cool example of how NARA's authority data might be linked to external web sources and how holdings with NARA might be linked to amplify context. Here we have, in the upper left, a World War II poster created and signed by Alfredo Plastino. Through research, we find that Alfredo Plastino is the same Superman illustrator, Al Plastino. He illustrated Superman for something around 30, 40 years. He unfortunately just died last fall. But luckily, his family still maintains the website that features all of his artwork. So exploiting EAC CPF, linking within NARA's description system, will help resolve issues of variant names used by records creators through their career, because the poster that National Archives has is signed Alfredo Plastino, but the Library of Congress considers his authorized controlled subject, his name heading, to be Al Plastino, or Plastino, Al, with no dates. I don't like it when names don't have dates. I've got to have more context. As an archives authorities cataloger, I have to have more context than that. So in fact, EAC CPF allows us to declare a preferred name for a person or group, or declare that all forms of the name are authorized. In traditional authority control, you have one preferred heading, and then all other variant headings for a person are considered non-preferred in traditional authority systems. But with EAC CPF, you can declare that all of this person's name forms are completely fine to use, and they become very searchable and linkable. And yes, the slide here shows where they just did an exhibit, or there's one item on exhibit at the Kennedy Library that features the cover of the Superman comic that was drawn within weeks of the JFK's assassination, and after all of that passed, they decided that whatever image he drew for President Kennedy should be in some kind of spirit figure. So that's how that comic book cover evolved. Okay, let's talk about linking names to names. Leland Judd Barrows and Mabel Barrows, husband and wife. He was the American ambassador to Cameroon and Togo. He was also a newspaper reporter and a broadcaster. His wife, Mabel Irene Connolly Barrows, is featured in a photograph here, which we have at the Harry S. Truman Library. We can use EACCPF authority format to link these two people together. If you find one person in the authority file, you can quickly link to the other person, from Mr. Barrow to Mrs. Barrow, as easy as that. Plus, you can also link out to external sources using hyperlinks and adding that information to the EACCPF record to cite a source, and you can take it, add in sources like findagrave.com, and there's the photograph of her gravestone. So when you see her EACCPF record, you can quickly go to her memorial and find a grave. Here's a really good one. Okay, so we talked about people to people, but here's people to people to people to corporate agency. Ralph James Bottles Capone and George Q.E. Johnson and the Department of Justice. So the Capone, this is Al Capone's older brother. And he was brought in for, I think, as a witness, or perhaps even suspected of being a cooperative person in tax evasion, like Al Capone was. So using EACCPF, the name data in this format, we can add in relationship context for his brother, the more famous Capone, for the attorney George E.Q. Johnson, who was the prosecutor, and to the corporate entity of the Department of Justice, Office of the U.S. Attorney for Northern Judicial District of Illinois. Whew, those are long headings. And then you can link out for sources as well to the Library of Congress name file, the VOF Wikipedia, which is becoming a very popular source for authority data these days, and Find a Grave. And my off-script story about Mr. Capone, Bottles, does anybody know why he was called Bottles? No, he didn't have big glasses. I don't know if he had glasses. Oh, no, that's not it though. And a lot of it, he did not butcher people with broken bottles. That's not how he got his gangster name. He actually ran a legitimate, legal bottled water business in Chicago, Illinois, and they called him Bottles Capone. There you go. You heard it here. Okay. So more about linking to the person to a corporate heading. This is something that has been going on actually at the National Archives for a long time. I always sort of like to give ourselves a pat on the back for this. That as early as 2002, when you see what here is an authority record from our ARC system, the production system, it's not what you see on the web, it provides us a mechanism for linking a person name to a federal agency name within one authority record. Because the name Johnson George E.Q., and his full heading is rather long, George Emerson Quincy, he was, of course, a federal employee, and he worked for the Department of Justice. And we can make this contextual link already inside our system. So linking is not entirely new to the National Archives. More really good stuff. And I will borrow from some of the things that Barb Aiken said earlier about collections, even though we're geographically very close. National Gallery, Archives of American Art is right up the street, National Archives is here. It's very interesting, just has become a fascination for me to see how this type of standard description of creators of archival materials can help us put in the puzzle pieces of where their materials might be, not only in this city, but around the country and around the world. So here we have an example of an oil painting that's actually in the National Archives. This is by Lee Winslow Court. There's the title of it. He was hired to go on an Antarctic expedition in the late 60s, and he was aboard the Chilean vessel, the Achilles, and he created about 8 oil studies. He was working in oil, but he was only making studies, and he took these back to his studio and made larger oil paintings of these. So you think, well, it's weird. Why do we have oil paintings at the National Archives? But we do, because they're related to other things. And that's, You don't take them apart, you don't destroy the provenance, you just move ahead. But where else can we learn more about Lee Winslow Court? At the Archives of American Art. Yes, I know, Marisa, the clouds part. The Archives of American Art has an oral history interview with Lee Winslow Court, and it's beautifully cataloged on their website and very helpful in my cataloging of this gentleman's name, except that I saw all of a sudden, oh, Rockport, Massachusetts. Hey, there's a place in EACCPF where you can link in or you can put in contextual information about a person's geographical context, where they were born, where they lived, where they worked, where they died, where they're buried. All of that stuff can go in there. Rockport, Massachusetts sort of set off an alarm for me, because Rockport, Massachusetts is heavily featured in another recently popular National Archives collection of Documerica photographs from the early 1970s from the EPA. Deborah Parks was the photographer. She lived part-time in Washington, D.C., part-time in Rockport, Massachusetts, and her assignment was to take pictures of Rockport, Massachusetts. So here are some of the, just a couple of her, a few of her photographs. But again, geographic context. We have power to link things geographically in context now. We don't currently have that with the change in RDA, the resource description and access, has made changes to the way we create MARC authority records to give it a little bit more context, but nothing like I think what's going to happen here. Another example of one photographer, Flip Schulke, who was a professor of photojournalism at the University of Missouri-Columbia. He had a number of students who he thought were really good ace photographers. He took them on a field trip, and they all became photographers for Documerica. These students we can all link together with Flip Schulke, by New Ulm, Minnesota, which is where they went on their field trip, by the corporate record for Documerica, and it just seems to be endless. There were about 100 photographers for Documerica, so this is just the ripple effect that will just go out and out and out. And most of those photographers had already worked for big name publications like National Geographic, and some are still even active today. So again, the possibilities are endless. One of my favorites, we happen to have artifacts at the National Archives. It's not entirely uncommon. Excuse me while I catch up. And since the 70s, I've been told, the National Archives has been acquiring artifact, textile items and other objects from the American Red Cross over the years. And recently, I was asked to create a name for Camilla Louise Wills. She was an Army nurse, and we have her coat. We have her coat from when she was in the Army, World War I. And I have to always say, well, it's very interesting, and to look at an empty coat on a mannequin is rather, leaves me with sort of a vacant feeling, like what's the story behind this object? It's just my natural instinct as a researcher and a cataloger to sort of find out. So I thought, is there more to this woman's story? And yes, there is. So you take a trip on Google, you will find the Camilla Louise Wills collection, beautifully described and displayed in the University of Virginia, the School of Nursing, and their Special Collections Department. And her entire, because she graduated from there, I'm sorry to say that, she graduated from there just before she left to go to Europe for World War I, and they have her entire collection. And so from here, I was able to pull a lot of her biographical information, which, by the way, I should say that traditional archival authority records up until recently had been limited to rather short biographies, but with EACCPF, you're allowed for very expansive biographies, so that's something I'm looking forward to. And I thought, now, I wonder what's in this collection. There was no item list on the website. It was just this page and a little bit of information around it. So I called, I said, would you happen to have photographs in this collection? And they said, yes, it does have photographs. I said, would you happen to have a picture of her wearing a black coat? And sure enough. So, an object at the National Archives. Her story is told here, but she has a larger form of her story at the University of Virginia. Using this new standard, we can go from National Archives to the University of Virginia, and we can send people who have somehow stumbled on this unusual black coat at the National Archives all the way to a photograph of her wearing this coat in, I don't know, circa 1917 perhaps. And parting thoughts. My big motto used to be, as an archives cataloger, catalog it and they will come. That was just, I typed it out and put it on my office door when I worked at the Holocaust Museum. I still hold on to that one, but my new one is, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you both very much. And I know we're running a little bit long, but we're going to be fine. Are there any questions in the room for either Jerry or John? And we'll just take a quick check and see if we have anything online. We do not. All right. So I think what we will do is we will thank our great presenters here, and we can move on to our next presentation if we are ready to go. Thank you very much. We will transition from the Jerry and John show to the Dawn and Meg show, so they can make their way up here to the stage. Who's going first? Or you're on one slide? One PowerPoint? Okay. Do you guys want to stay there? Do you want me to move your slides? Okay.
If you both want to just stay on the stage, you can control the slides that remote.
Yeah, I mean, you could also sit there and you could move them from there.
Okay.
Because you'll be able to see what's going on from right there.
Use the remote, or are you going to be up here?
You go sit down. You can sit. Well, you can move it from there. Okay. All right. I think we've worked out our logistics for our final presentation of the 2014 Archives Fair. It's me again, John LeGlowick, and I'm really looking forward to our final presenters. Dawn and Meg approached me about this idea several months ago, and I encouraged both of them to move forward on this great concept. And as we've been doing all day, if you have a question, please send it through the chat room. We'd really love to hear from your questions, those of you out in the field. But Dawn Sherman and Megan Ryan Gutthorn work in the textual accessioning unit of the National Archives in College Park. And Dawn holds a BA and an MA in history from Florida Atlantic University. She received an MLIS with a concentration in archives from the University of Maryland. Megan earned her undergraduate degree in history and English from Boston College and holds both an MA in history and an MLS with a concentration in archives from the University of Maryland. Please join me in welcoming both Dawn and Megan. Thank you very much.
Make it go. Make it go.
All right, go.
Okay, hi, and thank you for joining us this afternoon and staying through all of the other fantastic presentations. We appreciate you coming to ours. We're going to kind of shake things up a little bit this afternoon to make sure you're awake. We're going to do this in tandem, okay? And try our best. We're going to do our best. I am Dawn Sherman-Fells, and this is Megan Ryan Gutthorn, so we're going to stand up here and do this together. We hope that this presentation will be as good as the others. We have a brief disclaimer. While we are professional archivists who happen to work at the National Archives, we do not represent any initiative on behalf of the National Archives. So
this is our idea that we are pitching based on our experience at the National Archives, but not as representatives thereof.
Exactly. So that's out of the way. Yay. Okay. So while we are professional archivists, we are amateur presenters. So we're going to do the best that we can here. But you can think of us as the original dynamic duo. You know who I'm talking about, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Okay?
Yes?
Exactly.
Yes. No.
All in agreement? Any objections? Because Meg does have another one.
We could also go with Starsky and Hutch, Pinky and the Brain, or to be, more current, we could also go with Captain America and Black Widow. You can choose who's who, because what we're really going for here is a trailer or a preview of a greater presentation to come at NAAC in Rochester. So hopefully we'll get enough of you interested today that you'll show up at our session in Rochester. We're presenting on Friday mid-morning. It'll be awesome.
Yeah,
come.
I'm good with faces, so I will look for all of you.
You get bonus points. Double attendance gets bonus points. We'll come up with a prize.
It's going to be great. So at this point, I'm going to let Meg kind of start off with the concept and talk about the genesis of our idea and how our idea differs from current resources that are available to folks. And then I will speak in a couple more minutes. We've also decided if we need to kick each other or jump in, that's okay.
Yeah, so if one of us suddenly cuts off, it's because the other person stomped on them with their heel.
Exactly. You might hear us, but it's okay.
Roll with it.
Exactly.
Okay, so the Donated Records Partnership Project is really an idea, and what you're hearing today is our elevator pitch if the elevator got stuck between the 3rd and 4th floors and help wasn't coming for 15 minutes. So we're really coming at you with more of a concept than a product, and we're hoping that first, we're correct in identifying a need in the field, and second, that our PowerPoint doesn't die, and third, that there will be enough interest that we can actually develop a product to meet the need that we think we've identified. So I have been working as the point of contact for donated collections of privately held records or collections at National Archives in College Park for about 2 years now. And I started in that role when I was just out of grad school. I came in to take on this in addition to the other work I was doing, and I spoke with the woman who'd been handling it prior to me and asked her, what am I supposed to do, basically? And she explained, NARA has simultaneously a very broad and very narrow collecting policy, and one of my major responsibilities in handling records relating to private individuals, records in private custody, would be saying no, and saying no in the best possible way, because it's a big customer service function. Even if the National Archives is not the best home for a collection of records, that doesn't mean that they're not historically valuable or that they shouldn't be preserved. And a thing that we would be working on was creating timely, customized responses to proposed donations that aren't a good fit for the National Archives, in which I would need to recommend an alternate repository for the records, so that the donor would leave with having had a positive customer service experience even as we were turning them away. So, okay, I can do that. Timely. I am very good with timely. I do timely like no man's business. Where do I find these other repositories? And she looked at me, she said, Google. You Google, and then you cold call people. Because cold calling people is high on my list of favorite things to do. I said, there's got to be like a website somewhere. No, you Google, and then once you find something, you call them, because just because an institution has a large collection of World War II era private papers doesn't mean they want any more, or that even if they want more, that they have the resources available to maintain them, or that the phone number or email address listed on their website is current. And it's almost as bad to send a donor away with bad information as it is to send a donor away with no information. So you cold call. You make sure that a repository would be interested if the donor does approach them. You make sure that the phone number is good. You make sure the phone number reaches an actual person and not a voicemail, because a lot of the contact information listed on public-facing websites is geared at researchers and could be a common email address or a switchboard. So, okay, I can do this. She goes, and you'll know people. You'll call people you know, and they'll put you in touch with people they know. And I go, I graduated from grad school about a month ago. I know absolutely no one, but I can work on that. So Google. Did a lot of Googling. And sometimes I got a little frustrated with my Googling. So I complained to Dawn in the break room, because that's how I solve all my problems. And over time, we came up with the idea that if there was a lack in the field, a lack of a resource that allowed me to provide both a timely and a custom response to donors, because doing the research to identify an alternate repository is time consuming, and I, like everybody else in this field, wear many hats and perform many different things, and sometimes you can't drop everything to fill a need. So maybe there should be some kind of centralized, internal to the profession database, web tool, where professionals could post information that might not necessarily be the kind of thing that they want publicly available or easily identified by researchers. Yes, we have a large World War II collection, but we really don't have the resources for any more. But if you find anything on the Berlin airlift, we're doing an exhibit next year, and we'd be really interested in a loan. Or, we've historically collected only the records of individuals who attended our institution, but we're looking to branch out in light of this new science wing. So if you have anything from a scientist, we'd be interested. So that was the initial concept, a web-based tool that was password protected or otherwise internal to the profession to be used by cultural heritage professionals and to find or place collections. We thought of it from having several different goals. The idea of growing a collection, but not just growing the collection, maintaining the focus on the mission and sticking to a collection policy, which can be particularly difficult if you're working in an academic environment or in another environment when there are external pressures to take collections of individuals who have other interests in your repository or your institution, but the collections themselves don't necessarily line up with your donations policy. I once worked in a repository who had a primary focus on collecting religious records and accepted a lovely donation of historic comic books because the donor was affiliated with someone who knew someone and it would have been impolitic to say no. But you do want to cultivate those donor relations, even if you are saying no, because comic books are great, but you just don't have the resources to give them the preservation they need. You want to be able to say, but my friend here, or but this contact whose name and number, which I verified, they might want it. And we can point you in their direction. And maybe when you are ready to donate those records relating to your education, you could come back to us. And that requires a kind of professional collaboration, working together to make sure that donated collections, that records in private hands are properly placed with an institution that's best served to provide access and preservation and maintenance of the records. So how is this different from the tools that are out there, from Archives Grid, from the SAA listserv of primary source repository, from anything else, the New York Consortium, anything else that's out there to try and connect researchers with archives or with collections? And fundamentally, it's because they're out there to collect researchers with archives and collections. Archives Grid is awesome. It's all kinds of cool. I was on there the other day, but I've never been able to effectively use it to identify an active area of collecting interest. It is really great for finding institutions that are local if you're looking to place a collection within a certain geographic area, or if you're looking to identify an institution that has historically collected in a field. But it doesn't maintain information that says, you know, if you called me today about your inventor records, I couldn't take it. We did a couple years ago, but not anymore. And I've had experiences where I've called 4 other institutions trying to place a collection, and they've already been contacted by the donor and said no. So that's the kind of experience you want to try and avoid from a customer service perspective. You want to one and done as best you can. SAA and other listserv information is great, but frequently outdated, and also frequently just takes you to the home page of the institution where you then have to do further digging. And who should be involved in this kind of project? Well, everybody. It's a kind of a common thing. And we get, at the National Archives, we'll get offers of donations of artifacts that we're not well suited to maintain. Librarians can be, and people with special collections could also have the similar problems. Museum professionals, stewards of culture and history, regardless of who they are, people who work for historical sites or other, or corporate archives. We all face common challenges of what to do with donation offers that don't meet the institutional mission or fill our donations policy, and how to say no, how to break the news to the donor while making the offer, while still leaving the donor with a great customer service experience, and ultimately fulfilling the end goal of properly placing a collection in an institution that is best served to provide maintenance and preservation and access, how to grow collections that are mission-focused in this increasingly tight economic environment. So I've said placement a couple of times now, and I should probably define that. So determining placement, when I say that, I mean that historically significant records in private hands should be preserved and accessed from the most appropriate institution. And there are a lot of different things that I would think would play into that. What the collection focuses on, how big it is, how big the institution is, and what resources are available to handle a collection of any specific size, what kinds of records or artifacts are in that collection, and what kind of maintenance and preservation and access concerns they raise. So really, wouldn't it be great if a resource existed to help identify institutions that are actively collecting or at least open to new donations? A resource existed that captured elements of placement criteria that perhaps aren't best suited to be on your public researcher-facing website, something that's kind of internal to the profession and would make it really easy to do a prompt response to a donor, to provide great customer service and be able to redirect them so they don't call 4 different institutions who each say, no, call my friend. We want to say, here's the institution, or here's 3 options, and here are the contacts of the individuals you need to talk to, and they're all interested. I mean, really what we could say is, don't reject, redirect.
We've been waiting all day to say that.
Yes. We thought about pom-poms but decided against it.
Yeah, what do you do so good? So don't reject, redirect. We hope you find that slogan nifty, because we thought it was cool. So, and also, Andrew, there should be buttons, okay?
Big ones.
Big buttons. He makes buttons for MAAC, and they're really cool. So basically, don't reject, redirect. It's kind of like if you're going into a retail shop and you're looking for really awesome shoes, like Melissa, who presented this morning, had really awesome shoes, and I want to know where she got them. So you found these shoes online, and you go into the store because you need to try them on, because if you're like me, I could be a 5.5, a 6, or a 6.5. Crazy. So you go in with your heart set, these shoes are going to rock my outfit. And you get there and they don't have your size. They don't fit. And you're crushed. And you don't want to have to go to like the next town or 2 towns over to like see if they have the shoes. So the salesperson says, hey, let me call around. Let me see what I can find. And she finds the shoes for you. And they're going to be sent to your house with free shipping. I mean, really? So that's kind of what we're going after, is we can't help you at this site, but let us help you find the right direction. Let us help you find placement for the valuable records that you have. So that's kind of what's behind our don't reject, redirect slogan. Let's see. And now I'm talking and working.
I don't do the pointing.
She can't multitask. Yeah. Proposal. Basically what we're talking about is our idea. We want to collaborate with other collecting institutions and professional organizations. We need to leverage the expertise and resources in the profession. Meg and I know our technical limitations. She's much more talented than I am. I know nothing about techie stuff at all. I have her and my husband, and they take care of the things that I need to have done. But that's where we kind of need the professional organization. We're hoping one of our professional organizations, such as MAAC or SAA or someone, would think this is a really good idea and kind of want to take the administrative reins of this to kind of like start to really form it and hone it to make it into a reality. That's why we would need to establish a multi-institutional working group to develop a pilot, to test it out. Guinea pigs, if anybody here is interested, let us know. So roll it out to the people who would find this useful, either as a mechanism to redirect, reroute donations that are offered to them that don't suit their mission, or to go onto this site and kind of search for things that would be offered, because maybe the Lewis Historical Society in tiny little Lewis, Delaware is interested in something, and they don't have the funds to purchase, but this would be a really great way to maybe find that little nugget that would really bring something to their small institution. Once we would roll out the pilot, we would conduct analysis, make adjustments and policy decisions as needed, or find out, does this really work? Because it's great in our minds, but it may not actually work, and you need to find that out. And if it doesn't work, at least we could say we tried, right? It's my philosophy. And then gradually expand. And by expand, we mean take over the world, okay? Global. Pinky and the Brain style.
One archives conference at a time.
Exactly.
Start with MAAC.
Yes. So, proposed product and goals. Again, conceptual. A robust web resource that would help grow collections, maintain mission focus, cultivate donor relations, and cultivate professional collaboration, right? Because I kind of came up with this inkling of the idea attending another MAAC a year ago in the fall, when I attended a donations session where there were folks saying we kind of felt pressured to take a donation because it was kind of an important figure. And then someone else who said, we're struggling to get donations and to stay relevant and to stay afloat. So it's kind of something I think on different levels a lot of different institutions are dealing with. And resources needed. We need you guys. We need all of the folks in our profession. Your ideas. Again, Meg and I, we exist in the world of NARA in a room 5510 on the 5th floor.
We never leave.
We don't.
Even eat there.
We even eat inside. No records are there, though. No records. So our world is very small, and our interaction sometimes is very limited. So we don't have a really broad perspective that folks who work in other cultural institutions can bring. We need tech people, again, back to tech. IT knowledge, policy knowledge, marketing skills, server space, time, all those things that John actually outlined. I was very impressed with the, list that you were showing. I'm like, that's what we need. If we could just get started. So I might be emailing you later, John, to say, how did you get this started? And basically the benefits, right? What are the benefits? Working together, redirecting rather than rejecting, we build those professional relationships. We build strong customer service reputations, right? Because we don't want folks, calling Meg and Meg saying, no, we don't want it. And then them walking away and at a dinner party saying, those folks at NARA, they're jerks. They don't care about history, We want to be able to say, hey, this doesn't fit our mission, or your really important collection is going to get lost in the vast world of NARA. So let us help you find an appropriate place, an appropriate home that can showcase these important records. Build trust with the public. Again, that's by putting your best foot forward and trying to help them find the right home. And we want to build collections, collections that stay focused, but, help other institutions grow their collections where they need to. And if you're interested or have questions, you can join us in Rochester. You can take our survey that's currently available. You should have all, if you're part of NAAC, received the email blast, and it's still open. And you can always contact Meg or I directly via our email. Questions, comments, concerns? Recommendations for better jokes next time?
Yeah, we could use a couple of those, probably.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. We have a question. An actual valid question has come in.
Hi.
It works. We were wondering if it actually worked. The question is, how is it different from the archives list where offers are often made?
Well, there are many archives lists, so I'm not sure which one you're speaking about specifically.
I think we're referring to that darn list, as it's also known as, the SAA-sponsored Archives and Archivists listserv.
Well, I guess there are a couple of reasons there, for reasons that I would consider this different. First, because it's not an email blast, and I think that from a point of view of respecting donor privacy and really making sure that when donors contact us, it's not, or in my experience when donors contact us, it's not with the expectation that we're going to solicit other homes for them. It's with the expectation that their records belong with us. So when I'm looking to try and find an alternate placement, I would call around and be very vague. If the donor contacted you with records relating to, or maybe there was something that had something to do with, are you collecting? And I think that I would be very uncomfortable putting something in an email blast for privacy concerns and without the donor's express permission. So having a centralized resource where you could kind of find the information on your own without providing that kind of detail or blasting a lot of people, I think would be very helpful and also very efficient. A big problem or a big concern for us is timely response. I'm sure that it comes as a shock to a lot of people that the federal government doesn't have a great reputation in the timely response department. So I would prefer, when I'm working on this, to not wait for people to respond to my email. That can take days, and sometimes it's already been a couple by the time that I start working on a project. So I think that having a resource where you could go and find out quickly what's active, what institutions are active, and really not wait for a response, or wait very shortly for a response, or create a much more targeted email blast, would be very helpful.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any other questions? But he also, the same person who offered the previous question says, great talk, by the way. An excellent day. Kudos to all. Thank you very much. You or me? Is it me? All right. All right, well, we've been dwindling all day. For the last time, I am John McGlowick. I am the chair of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference. And I want to thank you all for attending the Archives Fair this year, an event that was rescheduled from October 2013, when this outing got caught up in the government shutdown. As you may know, the Archives Fair is traditionally held during Archives Month, which is in October of each year. The dedication of all those who worked on the fair this year is a testament to the professionalism of those individuals who worked so hard to make this event happen. I'd like to recognize the special event staff here at the Archives, especially Aaron Fernia and Quinn Brewster, our technical guru Mujib Chowdhury and his team for helping with the webcasting of today's presentations, Jeff Jackson and the whole AEB team here in the McGowan Theater. I'd like to thank the Archivist of the United States, David Ferrio, for letting us use his house for the Archives Fair this year and for his kind remarks this morning, as well as the entire management team here at the National Archives for allowing all of us and all of the NARA staff who participated in this great event today. I want to recognize and thank my colleague and predecessor as National Archives Assembly President Matt Hebert, who worked tirelessly to bring the Archives Fair back to the National Archives after a hiatus of several years. This event, which I hope will continue for many years to come, perhaps as soon as this fall, we can do it in October like we're supposed to. It's a fine example of collaboration among archival repositories throughout the DC region, as well as cooperation between two great professional groups, MARAC and the National Archives Assembly. In addition to Matt, I'd like to extend my congratulations to MARAC's DC Caucus representative, Andrew Cassidy-Amstutz, hiding up there in the back, who helped to organize the majority of the presentations that you heard here today. In addition to Andrew's everyday responsibilities at the Library of Congress and his dedication to MARAC, Andrew is also the host committee chair for this year's Society of American Archivists annual meeting, which will be here in Washington, D.C. In August. And it seems to me that, much like me, Andrew is one of those guys who will say yes to just about anybody. In addition to Matt and Andrew, there were others on the Archives Fair planning team, including Ellen Mulligan, who's been floating around all afternoon, the current Assembly Treasurer, Barb Akins, whom we heard from in the great session on the Monuments Men, and John Martinez, still sitting here in the front row, who participated in the session on the NAAC. I'd like to thank all of the other panelists as well, Alyssa, Helena, Ching-Sin, and Meredith, who gave us some great insight on crowdsourcing of archival access, Greg and May-Jean, who along with Barb shared those great stories of the Monuments Men with us, the Jerry and John show on the great work undertaken by the NAAC, and finally Dawn and Meg for their great idea of a donations partnership database, an idea that I've said has great merit and I hope to see move forward in the very near future. And if you missed this presentation, please come to Rochester where you can see it all again. I hope that everyone had the opportunity to speak with our exhibitors and repositories that joined us today out in the exhibit area. The number of tables out there reinforces my point of the success of this event, as does the people who attended the fair over the course of the day. Thank you all for your continued support of Archives, the National Archives, MARAC, the National Archives Assembly. Please note that the event planners are hoping to distribute a survey in the coming days that we hope you will take the opportunity to let us know what worked, what didn't, and what we can do better next time. What we do as archivists on a daily basis is important, and being able to share our successes with each other as well as those outside our profession, it makes our jobs that much easier, and we are more successful in the long run. My thanks to everyone, and I look forward to seeing you at the next Archives Fair. And thank you very much, and good evening.